Chapter 12: The Mediumship of Miss Showers. Some time before I had the pleasure of meeting Miss Showers, I heard, through friends living in the west of England, of the mysterious and marvelous powers possessed by a young lady of their acquaintance, who was followed by voices in the air, which held conversations with her, and the owners of which were said to have made themselves visible. I listened with curiosity, the more so, as my informants utterly disbelieved in spiritualism, and thought the phenomena were due to trickery. At the same time I conceived a great desire to see the girl of 16, who, for no gain or apparent object of her own, was so clever as to mystify everyone around her, and when she and her mother came to London, I was amongst the first to beg for an introduction, and I shall never forget the experiences I had with her. She was the first private medium through whom my personal friends returned to converse with me, and no one but a spiritualist can appreciate the blessing of spiritual communications through a source that is above the breath of suspicion. I have already written at length about Miss Showers in the story of John Powell's. She was a child, compared to myself, whose life had hardly commenced when mine was virtually over, and neither she, nor any member of her family, had ever had an opportunity of becoming acquainted with even the names of my former friends. Yet, as I have related, John Powell's made Miss Showers his especial mouthpiece, and my daughter Florence, then a little child, also appeared through her, though at long intervals, and rather timidly. Her own controls, however, or cabinet spirits, as they call them in America, i.e., such spirits as are always about the medium, and help the strangers to appear, Peter, Florence, Lenore, and Sally, were very familiar with me, and afforded me such facilities of testing their medium as do not often fall to the lot of inquirers. Indeed, at one time, they always requested that I should be present at their séances, so that I considered myself to be highly favored. And I may mention here that Miss Showers and I were so much en rapport that her manifestations were always much stronger in my presence. We could not sit next each other at an ordinary tea or supper table, when we had no thought of, or desire to hold a séance, without manifestations occurring in the full light. A hand, that did not belong to either of us, would make itself apparent under the tablecloth between us, a hand with power to grasp ours, or our feet would be squeezed or kicked beneath the table, or fingers would suddenly appear, and whisk the food off our plates. Some of their jests were inconvenient. I have had the whole contents of a tumbler, which I was raising to my lips, emptied over my dress. It was generally known that our powers were sympathetic, and at last Peter gave me leave, or, rather, ordered me to sit in the cabinet with Rosie, whilst the manifestations went on outside. He used to say he didn't care for me any more than if I had been a spirit myself. One evening Peter called me into the cabinet, which was simply a large box cupboard at one end of the dining room, before the séance began, and told me to sit down at the medium's feet and be a good girl and keep quiet. Miss Showers was in a low chair, and I sat with my arms resting on her lap. She did not become entranced, and we talked the whole time together. Presently, without any warning, two figures stood beside us. I could not have said where they came from. I neither saw them rise from the floor nor descend from the ceiling. There was no beginning to their appearance. In a moment they were simply there, Peter and Florence, not my child, but Miss Showers' control of the same names. Peter sent Florence out to the audience, where we heard her speaking to them and their remarks upon her, there being only a thin curtain hung before the entrance of the cabinet, but he stayed with us himself. We could not see him distinctly in the dim light, but we could distinctly hear and feel him. He changed our ornaments and ribbons, and pulled the hairpins out of our hair, and made comments on what was going on outside. After a while Florence returned to get more power, and both spirits spoke to and touched us at the same time. During the whole of this séance my arms rested on Miss Showers' lap, and she was awake and talking to me about the spirits. One evening, at a sitting at Mr. Luxmore's house in Hyde Park Square, the spirit Florence had been walking amongst the audience in the lighted front drawing-room for a considerable time, even sitting at the piano and accompanying herself whilst she sung us a song in what she called the planetary language. She greatly resembled her medium on that occasion, and several persons present remarked that she did so. I suppose the inferred doubt annoyed her, for before she finally left us she asked for a light, and a small oil lamp was brought to her which she placed in my hand, telling me to follow her and look at her medium, which I accordingly did. Florence led the way into the back drawing-room, where I found Miss Showers reposing in an armchair. The first sight of her terrified me. For the purpose of making any change in her dress as difficult as possible, she wore a high, tight-fitting black velvet frock, fastened at the back, and high Hessian boots, with innumerable buttons. But she now appeared to be shrunk to half her usual size, and the dress hung loosely on her figure. Her arms had disappeared, but putting my hands up the dress sleeves, I found them diminished to the size of those of a little child, the fingers reaching only to where the elbows had been. The same miracle had happened to her feet, which only occupied half her boots. She looked in fact like the mummy of a girl of 4 or 6 years old. The spirit told me to feel her face. The forehead was dry, rough, and burning hot, but from the chin water was dropping freely onto the bosom of her dress. Florence said to me,
"I wanted you to see her, because I know you are brave enough to tell people what you have seen."
There was a marked difference in the personality of the two influences, Florence and Lenore, although both at times resembled Miss Showers, and sometimes more than others. Florence was taller than her medium, and a very beautiful woman. Lenore was much shorter and smaller, and not so pretty, but more vivacious and pert. By the invitation of Mrs. McDougall Gregory, I attended several séances with Miss Showers at her residence in Green Street, when these spirits appeared. Lenore was fond of saying that she wouldn't or couldn't come out unless I held her hand, or put my arm round her waist. To tell the truth, I didn't care for the distinction, for this influence was very peculiar in some things, and to me she always appeared uncanny, and to leave an unpleasant feeling behind her. She was seldom completely formed, and would hold up a foot which felt like wet clay, and had no toes to it, or not the proper quantity. On occasions, too, there was a charnel house smell about her, as if she had been buried a few weeks and dug up again, an odor which I have never smelt from any materialized spirit before or after. One evening at Mrs. Gregory's, when Lenore had insisted upon walking round the circle supported by my arm, I nearly fainted from the smell. It resembled nothing but that of a putrid corpse, and when she returned to the cabinet, I was compelled to leave the room and retch from the nausea it had caused me. It was on this occasion that the sitters called Lenore so many times back into the circle, that all the power was gone, and she was in danger of melting away before their eyes. Still they entreated her to remain with them a little longer. At last she grew impatient, and complained to me of their unreasonableness. She was then raised from the floor, actually floating just outside the curtain, and she asked me to put my hands up her skirts and convince myself that she was half dematerialized. I did as she told me, and felt that she had no legs, although she had been walking round the room a few minutes before. I could feel nothing but the trunk of a body, which was completely lifted off the ground. Her voice, too, had grown faint and her face indistinct, and in another moment she had totally disappeared. One evening at Mrs. Gregory's, after the séance was concluded, Florence looked round the curtain and called to me to come inside of it. I did so and found myself in total darkness. I said, "What's the good of my coming here? I can't see anything." Florence took me by one hand, and answered,
"I will lead you. Don't be afraid."
Then someone else grasped my other hand, and Peter's voice said,
"We've got you safe. We want you to feel the medium."
The two figures led me between them to the sofa on which Miss Showers was lying. They passed my hand all over her head and body. I felt, as before, her hands and feet shrunk to half their usual size, but her heart appeared to have become proportionately increased. When my hand was placed upon it, it was leaping up and down violently, and felt like a rabbit or some other live animal bounding in her bosom. Her brain was burning as before, but her extremities were icy cold. There was no doubt at all of the abnormal condition into which the medium had been thrown, in order to produce these strong physical manifestations which were borrowed, for the time being, from her life, and could never, so they informed me, put the whole of what they borrowed back again. This seems to account for the invariable deterioration of health and strength that follows physical manifestations in both sexes. These were the grounds alone on which they explained to me the fact that, on several occasions, when the materialized spirit has been violently seized and held apart from the medium, it has been found to have become, or been changed into the medium, and always with injury to the latter, as in the case of Florence Cook being seized by Mr. Volkman and Sir George Sitwell. Mr. Volkman concluded because when he seized the spirit Katie King, He found he was holding Florence Cook, that the latter must have impersonated the former, yet I shall tell you in its proper place how I have sat in the same room with Katie King, whilst Miss Cook lay in a trance between us. The medium nearly lost her life on the occasion alluded to, from the sudden disturbance of the mysterious link that bound her to the spirit. I have had it from the lips of the Countess of Caithness, who was one of the sitters, and stayed with Miss Cook till she was better, that she was in convulsions the whole night after, and that it was some time before they believed she would recover. If a medium could simulate a materialized spirit, it is hardly likely that she would, or could, simulate convulsions with a medical man standing by her bedside.
You see,
Said Miss Showers Florence, whilst pointing out to me the decreased size of her medium under trance.
that Rosie is half her usual size and weight. I have borrowed the other half from her, which, combined with contributions from the sitters, goes to make up the body in which I show myself to you. If you seize and hold me tight, you are holding her, i.e., half of her, and you increase the action of the vital half to such a degree that, if the two halves did not reunite, you would kill her. You see that I can detach certain particles from her organism for my own use, and when I dematerialize, I restore these particles to her, and she becomes once more her normal size. You only hurry the reunion by violently detaining me, so as to injure her. But you might drive her mad, or kill her in the attempt, because the particles of brain, or body, might become injured by such a violent collision. If you believe I can take them from her, as you see I do, in order to render my invisible body visible to you, why can't you believe I can make them fly together again, on the approach of danger? And granted the one power, I see no difficulty in acknowledging the other.
One day Mrs. Showers invited me to assist at a séance to be given expressly for friends living at a distance. When I reached the house, however, I found the friends were unable to be present, and the meeting was adjourned. Mrs. Showers apologized for the alteration of plan, but I was glad of it. I had often sat with Rosie in company with others, and I wanted to sit with her quite alone, or rather to sit with her in a room quite alone, and see what would spontaneously occur, without any solicitation on our parts. We accordingly annexed the drawing room for our sole use, locked the door, extinguished the lights, and sat down on a sofa side by side, with our arms round each other. The manifestations that followed were not all nice ones. They formed an experience to be passed through once, but not willingly repeated, and I should not relate them here, excepting that they afford so strong a proof that they were produced by a power outside and entirely distinct from our own, a power, which having once called into action, we had no means of repressing. We had sat in the dark for some minutes, without hearing or seeing anything, when I thoughtlessly called out, "Now, Peter, do your worst," and extending my arms, singing, "Come." For my arms are empty. In a moment a large, heavy figure fell with such force into my outstretched arms as to bruise my shoulder. It seemed like a form made of wood or iron, rather than flesh and blood, and the rough treatment that ensued for both of us is almost beyond description. It seemed as if the room were filled with materialized creatures, who were determined to let us know they were not to be trifled with. Our faces and hands were slapped, our hair pulled down, and our clothes nearly torn off our backs. My silk skirt being separate from the bodice was torn off at the waistband, and the trimming ripped from it, and Miss Showers' muslin dress was also much damaged. We were both thoroughly frightened, but no expostulations or entreaties had any effect with our tormentors. At the same time we heard the sound as of a multitude of large birds or bats swooping about the room. The fluttering of wings was incessant, and we could hear them scrooping up and down the walls. In the midst of the confusion, Rosie was whisked out of my arms, for fright had made us cling tighter than ever together, and planted on the top of a table at some distance from me, at which she was so frightened she began to cry, and I called out, "Powles, where are you? Can't you stop them?" My appeal was heard. Peter's voice exclaimed,
"Hullo, here's Powell's coming."
and all the noise ceased. We heard the advent of my friend, and in another moment he was smoothing down the ruffled hair and arranging the disordered dresses and telling me to light the gas and not be frightened. As soon as I could I obeyed his directions and found Rosie sitting doubled up in the center of the table, but the rest of the room and furniture in its usual condition. Peter and his noisy crowd had vanished, so had Powles, and there was nothing but our torn skirts and untidy appearance to prove that we had not been having an unholy dream. Peter is not a wicked spirit, far from it, but he is a very earthly and frivolous one. But when we consider that 9/10 of the spirits freed from the flesh are both earthly and frivolous, if not worse, I know not what right we have to expect to receive back angels in their stead. At one time when my sister Blanche, who was very skeptical as to the possibility of the occurrences I related having taken place before me, was staying in my house at Bayswater, I asked Miss Showers if she would give us a séance in my own home, to which she kindly assented. This was an unusual concession on her part, because, in consequence of several accidents and scandals that had occurred from media being forcibly detained, as I have just alluded to, her mother was naturally averse to her sitting anywhere but in their own circle. However, on my promising to invite no strangers, Mrs. Showers herself brought her daughter to my house. We had made no preparation for the séance except by opening part of the folding doors between the dining room and study, and hanging a curtain over the aperture. But I had carefully locked the door of the study, so that there should be no egress from it excepting through the dining room, and had placed against the locked door a heavy writing table laden with books and ornaments to make assurance doubly sure. We sat first in the drawing room above, where there was a piano. The lights were extinguished, and Miss Showers sat down to the instrument and played the accompaniment to a very simple melody, Under the Willow She's Sleeping. For voices, sometimes alone and sometimes all together, accompanied her own. One was a baritone, supposed to proceed from Peter, the second, a soprano, from Lenore. The third was a rumbling bass, from an influence who called himself the Vicar of Croydon, and sung in a fat, unctuous, and conceited voice, and the fourth was a cracked and quavering treble, from another spirit called the Abbess. These were the voices, Mrs. Showers told me, that first followed her daughter about the house in Devonshire, and gained her such an unenviable notoriety there. The four voices were perfectly distinct from one another, and sometimes blended most ludicrously and tripped each other up in a way which made the song a medley upon which each one would declare it was the fault of the other. The Vicar of Croydon always required a great deal of solicitation before he could be induced to exhibit his powers, but having once commenced, it was difficult to make him leave off again, whereas the Abbess was always complaining that they would not allow her to sing the solos. An infant's voice also sung some baby songs in a sweet childish treble, but she was also very shy and seldom was heard, in comparison with the rest. All ventriloquism? I hear some reader cry. If so, Miss Showers ought to have made a fortune in exhibiting her talent in public. I have heard the best ventriloquists in the world, but I never heard one who could produce four voices at the same time. After the musical portion of the séance was over, we descended to the dining room, where the gas was burning, and the medium passed through it to the secured study, where a mattress was laid upon the floor for her accommodation. Florence was the first to appear, tall and beautiful in appearance, and with upraised eyes like a nun. She measured her height against the wall with me, and we found she was the taller of the two by a couple of inches, my height being 5 feet 6, the medium's 5 feet, and the spirit's 5 feet 8, an abnormal height for a woman. Lenore came next, very short indeed, looking like a child of 4 or 6, but she grew before our eyes, until her head was on a level with mine. She begged us all to observe that she had not got on Rose's petticoat body. She said she had borrowed it on one occasion, and Mrs. Showers had recognized it, and slipped upstairs in the middle of the séance and found it missing from her daughter's chest of drawers, and that she had been so angry in consequence, fearing Rose's honor might be impeached, that she said if Lenore did not promise never to do so again, she should not be allowed to assist at the séances at all. So Miss Lenore, in rather a pert and defiant mood, begged Mrs. Showers to see that what she wore was her own property, and not that of the medium. She was succeeded on that occasion by a strange being, totally different from the other two, who called herself Sally, and said she had been a cook. She was one of those extraordinary influences for whose return to earth one can hardly account, quick, and clever, and amusing as she could be, but with an unrefined wit and manner, and to all appearance, more earthly-minded than ourselves. But do we not often ask the same question with respect to those still existent here below? What were they born for? What good do they do? Why were they ever permitted to come? God, without whose permission nothing happens, alone can answer it. We had often to tease Peter to materialize and show himself, but he invariably refused, or postponed the work to another occasion. His excuse was that the medium being so small, he could not obtain sufficient power from her to make himself appear as a big man, and he didn't like to come, looking like a girl in a billycock hat.
I came once to Mrs. Shower's,
He said,
and she declared I was rosy dressed up, and so I have resolved never to show myself again.
At the close of that séance, however, Peter asked me to go into the study and see him wake the medium. When I entered it and made my way up to the mattress, I found Miss Showers extended on it in a deep sleep, whilst Peter, materialized, sat at her feet. He made me sit down next to him and take his hand and feel his features with my own hand. Then he proceeded to rouse Rosie by shaking her and calling her by name, holding me by one hand, as he did so. As Miss Showers yawned and woke up from her trance, the hand slipped from mine, and Peter evaporated. When she sat up, I said to her gently, "I am here." Peter brought me in and was sitting on the mattress by my side till just this moment.
Ha ha, and she declared I was rosy dressed up, and so I have resolved never to show myself again.
At the close of that séance, however, Peter asked me to go into the study and see him wake the medium. When I entered it and made my way up to the mattress, I found Miss Showers extended on it in a deep sleep, whilst Peter, materialized, sat at her feet. He made me sit down next to him and take his hand and feel his features with my own hand. Then he proceeded to rouse Rosie by shaking her and calling her by name, holding me by one hand, as he did so. As Miss Showers yawned and woke up from her trance, the hand slipped from mine, and Peter evaporated. When she sat up, I said to her gently, "I am here." Peter brought me in and was sitting on the mattress by my side till just this moment.
Ha ha,
Laughed his voice close to my ear.
and I'm here still, my dears, though you can't see me.
Who can account for such things? I have witnessed them over and over again, yet I am unable, even to this day, to do more than believe and wonder. Chapter 13: The Mediumship of William Eglinton. In the stories I have related of Emily and the monk, I have alluded freely to the wonderful powers exhibited by William Eglinton, but the marvels there spoken of were by no means the only ones I have witnessed through his mediumship. At the séance which produced the apparition of my sister Emily, Mr. Eglinton's control Joey made himself very familiar. Joey is a remarkably small man, perhaps 2/3 lighter in weight than the medium, and looks more like a little jockey than anything else, though he says he was a clown whilst in this world, and claims to be the spirit of the immortal Joe Grimaldi. He has always appeared to us clothed in a tight-fitting white dress like a woven jersey suit, which makes him look still smaller than he is. He usually keeps up a continuous chatter, whether visible or invisible, and is one of the cleverest and kindest controls I know. He is also very devotional, for which the public will perhaps give him as little credit now as they did whilst he was on earth. On the first occasion of our meeting in the Russell Street rooms, he did not show himself until quite the last, but he talked incessantly of and for the other spirits that appeared. My sister was, as I have said, the first to show herself. Then came an extraordinary apparition. On the floor, about 3 feet from the cabinet, appeared a head, only the head and throat of a dark man, with black beard and moustaches, surmounted by the white turban usually worn by natives. It did not speak, but the eyes rolled and the lips moved, as if it tried to articulate, but without success. Joey said the spirit came for Colonel Lean, and was that of a foreigner who had been decapitated. Colonel Lean could not recognize the features, but, strange to say, he had been present at the beheading of 2 natives in Japan who had been found guilty of murdering some English officers, and we concluded from Joey's description that this must be the head of one of them. I knelt down on the floor and put my face on a level with that of the spirit, that I might assure myself there was no body attached to it and concealed by the curtain of the cabinet, and I can affirm that it was a head only, resting on the neck, that its eyes moved and its features worked, but that there was nothing further on the floor. I questioned it, and it evidently tried hard to speak in return. The mouth opened and the tongue was thrust out, and made a sort of dumb sound, but was unable to form any words, and after a while the head sunk through the floor and disappeared. If this was not one of the pleasantest apparitions I have seen, it was one of the most remarkable. There was no possibility of trickery or deception. The decapitated head rested in full sight of the audience, and had all the peculiarities of the native appearance and expression. After this the figures of 2 or 3 Englishmen came, friends of others of the audience. Then Joey said he would teach us how to make muslin. He walked right outside the cabinet, a quaint little figure, not much bigger than a boy of 12 or 13, with a young, old face, and dressed in the white suit I have described. He sat down by me and commenced to toss his hands in the air, as though he were juggling with balls, saying the while,
"This is the way we make ladies' dresses."
As he did so, a small quantity of muslin appeared in his hands, which he kept on moving in the same manner, whilst the flimsy fabric increased and increased before our eyes, until it rose in billows of muslin above Joey's head and fell over his body to his feet, and enveloped him until he was completely hidden from view. He kept on chattering till the last moment from under the heap of snowy muslin, telling us to be sure and remember how he made ladies' dresses, when, all of a sudden, in the twinkling of an eye, the heap of muslin rose into the air, and before us stood the tall figure of Abdallah, Mr. Eglinton's Eastern guide. There had been no darkness, no pause to effect this change. The muslin had remained on the spot where it was fabricated until Joey evaporated, and Abdallah rose up from beneath it. Now Abdallah is not a spirit to be concealed easily. He is 6'2", a great height for a native, and his high turban adds to his stature. He is a very handsome man, with an aquiline nose and bright black eyes, a Persian, I believe, by birth, and naturally dark in complexion. He does not speak English, but salams continually, and will approach the sitters when requested, and let them examine the jewels, of which he wears a large quantity in his turban and ears and round his throat, or to show them and let them feel that he has lost one arm, the stump being plainly discernible through his thin clothing. Abdallah possesses all the characteristics of the Eastern nation, which are unmistakable to one who, like myself, has been familiar with them in the flesh. His features are without doubt those of a Persian, so is his complexion. His figure is long and lithe and supple, as that of a cat, and he can bend to the ground and rise again with the utmost ease and grace. Anybody who could pretend for a moment to suppose that Mr. Eglinton by making up could personate Abdallah must be a fool. It would be an impossibility, even were he given unlimited time and assistance, to dress for the character. There is a peculiar boneless elasticity in the movements of a native which those who have lived in the East know that no Englishman can imitate successfully. Abdallah's hand and feet also possess all the characteristics of his nationality, being narrow, long and nerveless, although I have heard that he can give rather too good a grip with his one hand when he chooses to exert his power or to show his dislike to any particular sitter. He has always, however, shown the utmost urbanity towards us, but he is not a particularly friendly or familiar spirit. When Abdallah had retired on this occasion, Joey drew back the curtain that shaded the cabinet, and showed us his medium and himself. There sat Mr. Eglinton attired in evening dress, with the front of his shirt as smooth and spotless as when it left the laundress' hands, lying back in his chair in a deep sleep, whilst little Joey sat astride his knee, his white suit contrasting strangely with his medium's black trousers. Whilst in this position he kissed Mr. Eglinton several times, telling him to wake up, and not look so sulky. Then, having asked if we all saw him distinctly, and were satisfied he was not the medium, he bade God bless us, and the curtains closed once more upon this incomprehensible scene. Mr. Eglinton subsequently became an intimate friend of ours, and we often had the pleasure of sitting with him, but we never saw anything more wonderful, to my mind, than we did on our first acquaintance. When he accompanied us to Bruges, as told in the history of the monk, Joey took great trouble to prove to us incontrovertibly that he is not an emanation, or double, of his medium, but a creature completely separate and wholly distinct. My sister's house, being built on a very old-fashioned principle, had all the bedrooms communicating with each other. The entresol in which we usually assembled formed the connecting link to a series of 6 chambers, all of which opened into each other, and the entrance to the first and last of which was from the entresol. We put Mr. Eglinton into number 1, locking the connecting door with number 2, so that he had no exit except into our circle as we sat round the curtain, behind which we placed his chair. Joey, having shown himself outside the curtain, informed us he was going through the locked door at the back into our bedrooms, numbers 2, 3 and 4, and would bring us something from each room. Accordingly, in another minute we heard his voice in number 2, commenting on all he saw there. Then he passed into number 3, and so on, making a tour of the rooms, until he appeared at the communicating door of number 5, and threw an article taken from each room into the entresol. He then told us to lift the curtain and inspect the medium, which we did, finding him fast asleep in his chair, with the door behind him locked. Joey then returned by the way he had gone, and presented himself once more outside the cabinet, the key of the locked door being all the time in our possession. Ernest is another well-known control of Mr. Eglinton's, though he seldom appears, except to give some marvelous test or advice. He is a very earnest, deep-feeling spirit, like his name, and his symbol is a cross of light, sometimes large and sometimes small, but always bright and luminous. Ernest seldom shows his whole body. It is generally only his face that is apparent in the midst of the circle, a more convincing manifestation for the skeptic or inquirer than any number of bodies which are generally attributed to the chicanery of the medium. Ernest always speaks in the direct voice in a gentle, bass tone, entirely distinct from Joey's treble, and his appearance is usually indicative of a harmonious and successful meeting. Daisy, a North American Indian girl, is another control of William Eglinton's, but I have only heard her speak in trance. I do not know which of these spirits it is who conducts the manifestations of writing on the arm, with which Mr. Eglinton is very successful. Sometimes it seems to be one, and sometimes the other. As he was sitting with our family at supper one evening, I mentally asked Joey to write something on some part of his body where his hand could not reach. This was in order to prove that the writing had not been prepared by chemical means beforehand, as some people are apt to assert. In a short time Mr. Eglinton was observed to stop eating, and grow very fidgety and look uncomfortable, and on being questioned as to the cause, he blushed and stammered, and could give no answer. After a while he rose from table, and asked leave to retire to his room. The next morning he told us that he had been so uneasy at supper, it had become impossible for him to sit it out, that on reaching his room he had found that his back, which irritated him as though covered with a rash, had a sentence written across it, of which he could only make out a few words by looking at it backwards in a glass. And as there were only ladies in the house beside himself, he could not call in an interpreter to his assistance. One day, without consulting him, I placed a small card and a tiny piece of black lead between the leaves of a volume of the Leisure Hour, and asked him to hold the book with me on the dining table. I never let the book out of my hand, and it was so thick that I had difficulty afterwards in finding my card, from the corner of which I had torn a piece, again. Mr. Eglinton sat with me in the daylight with the family about, and all he did was to place his hand on mine, which rested on the book. The perspiration ran down his face whilst he did so, but there was no other sign of power, and, honestly, I did not expect to find any writing on my card. When I had shaken it out of the leaves of the book, however, I found a letter closely written on it from my daughter Florence to this effect. Dear Mamma, I am so glad to be able to communicate with you again, and to demonstrate by actual fact that I am really present. Of course, you quite understand that I do not write this myself. Charlie is present with me, and so are many more, and we all unite in sending you our love. Your daughter, Florence. Mr. Eglinton's mediumship embraces various phases of phenomena, as may be gathered from his own relations of them, and the testimony of his friends. A narrative of his spiritual work, under the title of Twixt Two Worlds, has been written and published by Mr. John T. Farmer, and contains some exhaustive descriptions of, and testimonies to, his undoubtedly wonderful gifts. In it appear several accounts written by myself, and which, for the benefit of such of my readers as have not seen the book in question, I will repeat here. The first is that of the monk, given in extenso, as I have given it in the 11th chapter of this book. The second is of a séance held on the 5th of September, 1884. The circle consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Stewart, Colonel and Mrs. Winch, Mr. and Mrs. Russell Davies, Mr. Morgan, and Colonel Lean and myself, and was held in Mr. Eglinton's private chambers in Quebec Street. We sat in the front drawing-room, with one gas burner alight, and the door having been properly secured, Mr. Eglinton went into the back room, which was divided by curtains from the front. He had not left us a couple of minutes before a man stepped out through the portière, and walked right into the midst of us. He was a large, stout man, and very dark, and most of the sitters remarked that he had a very peculiar smell. No one recognized him, and after appearing 2 or 3 times he left, and was immediately succeeded by a woman, very much like him, who also had to leave us without any recognition. These 2 spirits, before taking a final leave, came out together, and seemed to examine the circle curiously. After a short interval a much smaller and slighter man came forward, and darted in a peculiar slouching attitude round the circle. Colonel Lean asked him to shake hands. He replied by seizing his hand, and nearly dragging him off his seat. He then darted across the room, and gave a similar proof of his muscular power to Mr. Stewart. But when I asked him to notice me, he took my hand and squeezed it firmly between his own. He had scarcely disappeared before Abdullah, with his one arm and his 6 feet 2 of height, stood before us, and salaamed all round. Then came my daughter Florence, a girl of 19 by that time, very slight and feminine in appearance. She advanced 2 or 3 times, near enough to touch me with her hand, but seemed fearful to approach nearer. But the next moment she returned, dragging Mr. Eglinton after her. He was in deep trance, breathing with difficulty, but Florence held him by the hand and brought him up to my side, when he detached my hands from those of the sitters either side of me, and making me stand up, he placed my daughter in my arms. As she stood folded in my embrace, she whispered a few words to me relative to a subject known to no one but myself, and she placed my hand upon her heart, that I might feel she was a living woman. Colonel Lean asked her to go to him. She tried and failed, but having retreated behind the curtain to gather strength, she appeared the second time with Mr. Eglinton, and calling Colonel Lean to her, embraced him. This is one of the most perfect instances on record of a spirit form being seen distinctly by 10 witnesses with the medium under gas. The next materialization that appeared was for Mr. Stewart. This gentleman was newly arrived from Australia, and a stranger to Mr. Eglinton. As soon as he saw the female form, who beckoned him to the portiere to speak to her, he exclaimed, "My God! Pauline," with such genuine surprise and conviction as were unmistakable. The spirit then whispered to him, and putting her arms round his neck, affectionately kissed him. He turned after a while, and addressing his wife, told her that the spirit bore the very form and features of their niece Pauline, whom they had lost the year before. Mr. Stewart expressed himself entirely satisfied with the identity of his niece, and said she looked just as she had done before she was taken ill. I must not omit to say that the medium also appeared with this figure, making the 3rd time of showing himself in one evening with the spirit form. The next apparition, being the 7th that appeared, was that of a little child apparently about 2 years old, who supported itself in walking by holding on to a chair. I stooped down, and tried to talk to this baby, but it only cried in a fretful manner, as though frightened at finding itself with strangers, and turned away. The attention of the circle was diverted from this sight by seeing Abdullah dart between the curtains, and stand with the child in our view, whilst Mr. Eglinton appeared at the same moment between the 2 forms, making a tria juncta in uno. Thus ended the séance. The second one of which I wrote took place on the 27th of the same month, and under very similar circumstances. The circle this time consisted of Mrs. Wheeler, Mr. Woods, Mr. Gordon, the Honourable Gordon Sandman, my daughter Eva, my son Frank, Colonel Lean, and myself. Mr. Eglinton appeared on this occasion to find some difficulty in passing under control, and he came out so frequently into the circle to gather power, that I guessed we were going to have uncommonly good manifestations. The voice of Joey, too, begged us under no circumstances whatever, to lose hands, as they were going to try something very difficult, and we might defeat their efforts at the very moment of victory. When the medium was at last under control in the back drawing-room, a tall man, with an uncovered head of dark hair, and a large beard, appeared and walked up to a lady in the company. She was very much affected by the recognition of the spirit, which she affirmed to be that of her brother. She called him by name and kissed him, and informed us that he was just as he had been in earth life. Her emotion was so great, we thought she would have fainted, but after a while she became calm again. We next heard the notes of a clarionet. I had been told that Mr. Woods, a stranger just arrived from the Antipodes, had lost a brother under peculiarly distressing circumstances, and that he hoped, though hardly expected, to see his brother that evening. It was the first time I had ever seen Mr. Woods, Yet so remarkable was the likeness between the brothers, that when a spirit appeared with a clarionet in his hand, I could not help knowing who it was, and exclaimed, "Oh, Mr. Woods, there is your brother." The figure walked up to Mr. Woods and grasped his hand. As they appeared thus with their faces turned to one another, they were strikingly alike both in feature and expression. This spirit's head was also bare, an unusual occurrence, and covered with thick, crisp hair. He appeared twice, and said distinctly, "God bless you," each time to his brother. Mrs. Wheeler, who had known the spirit in earth life, was startled by the tone of the voice, which she recognized at once, and Mr. Morgan, who had been an intimate friend of his in Australia, confirmed the recognition. We asked Mr. Woods the meaning of the clarionet, which was a black one, handsomely inlaid with silver. He told us his brother had been an excellent musician, and had won a similar instrument as a prize at some musical competition. "But," he added wonderingly, "his clarionet is locked up in my house in Australia." My daughter Florence came out next, but only a little way, at which I was disappointed, but Joey said they were reserving the strength for a manifestation further on. He then said, "Here comes a friend for Mr. Sandman," and a man, wearing the Masonic badge and scarf, appeared, and made the tour of the circle, giving the Masonic grip to those of the craft present. He was a good-looking young man, and said he had met some of those present in Australia, but no one seemed to recognize him. He was succeeded by a male figure, who had materialized on the previous occasion. As he passed through the curtain, a female figure appeared beside him, bearing a very bright light, as though to show him the way. She did not come beyond the portiere, but everyone in the room saw her distinctly. On account of the dress and complexion of the male figure, we had wrongly christened him the Bedouin, but my son, Frank Marryat, who is a sailor, now found out he was an East Indian by addressing him in Hindustani, to which he responded in a low voice. Someone asked him to take a seat amongst us, upon which he seized a heavy chair in one hand and flourished it above his head. He then squatted, native fashion, on his haunches on the floor and left us, as before, by vanishing suddenly. Joey now announced that they were going to try the experiment of showing us how the spirits were made from the medium. This was the crowning triumph of the evening. Mr. Eglinton appeared in the very midst of us in trance. He entered the room backwards, and as if fighting with the power that pushed him in, his eyes were shut, and his breath was drawn with difficulty. As he stood thus, holding on to a chair for support, an airy mass like a cloud of tobacco smoke was seen on his left hip, his legs became illuminated by lights traveling up and down them, and a white film settled about his head and shoulders. The mass increased, and he breathed harder and harder, whilst invisible hands pulled the filmy drapery out of his hip in long strips, that amalgamated as soon as formed, and fell to the ground to be succeeded by others. The cloud continued to grow thicker, and we were eagerly watching the process, when, in the twinkling of an eye, the mass had evaporated, and a spirit, full-formed, stood beside him. No one could say how it had been raised in the very midst of us, nor whence it came, but it was there. Mr. Eglinton then retired with the newborn spirit behind the curtains, but in another moment he came, or he was thrown out, amongst us again, and fell upon the floor. The curtains opened again, and the full figure of Ernest appeared and raised the medium by the hand. As he saw him, Mr. Eglinton fell on his knees, and Ernest drew him out of sight. Thus ended the second of these two wonderful séances. Thus published reports of them were signed with the full names and addresses of those who witnessed them. William Eglinton's powers embrace various phases of phenomena, amongst which levitation is a common occurrence. Indeed, I do not think I have ever sat with him at a séance during which he has not been levitated. I have seen him on several occasions rise, or be carried, into the air, so that his head touched the ceiling, and his feet were above the sitters' heads. On one occasion whilst sitting with him a perfectly new manifestation was developed. As each spirit came the name was announced, written on the air in letters of fire, which moved round the circle in front of the sitters. As the names were those of friends of the audience and not of friends of Mr. Eglinton, and the phenomenon ended with a letter written to me in the same manner on private affairs, it could not be attributed to a previously arranged trick. I have accompanied Mr. Eglinton, in the capacity of interpreter, to a professional séance in Paris consisting of some 40 persons, not one of whom could speak a word of English whilst he was equally ignorant of foreign languages. And I have heard French and German spirits return through him to converse with their friends, who were radiant with joy at communicating with them again, whilst their medium could not, had he been conscious, have understood or pronounced a single word of all the news he was so glibly repeating. I will conclude this testimony to his powers by the account of a sitting with him for slate writing, that much abused and most maligned manifestation. Because a few ignorant pig-headed people who have never properly investigated the science of spiritualism decide that a thing cannot be, because it can't, men of honor and truth are voted charlatans and tricksters, and those who believe in them fools and blind. The day will dawn yet when it will be seen which of the two classes best deserve the name. Some years ago, when I first became connected in business with Mr. Edgar Lee of the St. Stephen's Review, I found him much interested in the subject of spiritualism, though he had never had an opportunity of investigating it, and through my introduction I procured him a test séance with William Eglinton. We met one afternoon at the medium's house in Nottingham Place for that purpose, and sat at an ordinary table in the back dining room for slate writing. The slate used on the occasion, as Mr. Lee had neglected to bring his own slate as requested, was one which was presented to Mr. Eglinton by Mr. Gladstone. It consisted of 2 slates of medium size, set in mahogany frames, with box hinges, and which, when shut, were fastened with a Brahma lock and key. On the tablecloth was a collection of tiny pieces of different colored chalk. In the front room, which was divided from us by folding doors, were some bookcases. Mr. Eglinton commenced by asking Mr. Lee to go into the front room by himself, and select, in his mind's eye, any book he chose as the one from which extracts should be given. Mr. Lee, having done as he was told, returned to his former place beside us, without giving a hint as to which book he had selected. Mr. Gladstone's slate was then delivered over to him to clean with sponge and water. That done, he was directed to choose 4 pieces of chalk and place them between the slates, to lock them and retain the key. The slates were left on the table in the sight of all. Mr. Lee's hand remained on them all the time. All that Mr. Eglinton did was to place his hand above Mr. Lee's.
You chose, I think,
He commenced.
for morsels of chalk, white, blue, yellow, and red. Please say which word, on which line, on which page of the book you selected just now, the white chalk shall transcribe.
Mr. Lee answered, I forget the exact numbers, somewhat in this wise: the 3rd word on the 15th line of the 102nd page, he having, it must be remembered, no knowledge of the contents of the volume, which he had not even touched with his hand. Immediately he had spoken, a scratching noise was heard between the 2 slates. When it ceased, Mr. Eglinton put the same question with regard to the blue, yellow and red chalks, which was similarly responded to. He then asked Mr. Lee to unlock the slates, read the words, and then fetch the book he had selected, and compare notes, and in each instance the word had been given correctly. Several other experiments were then made, equally curious: the number of Mr. Lee's watch, which he had not taken from his pocket, and which he said he did not know himself, being amongst them. Then Mr. Eglinton said to Mr. Lee,
Have you any friend in the spirit world from whom you would like to hear? If so, and you will mentally recall the name, we will try and procure some writing from him or her.
I must say here that these 2 were utter strangers to each other, and had met for the first time that afternoon, and indeed, as will be seen by the context, I had a very slight knowledge of Mr. Edgar Lee myself at that time. Mr. Lee thought for a moment, and then replied that there was a dead friend of his from whom he should like to hear. The cleaning and locking process was gone through again, and the scratching recommenced, and when it concluded, Mr. Lee unlocked the slates and read a letter to this effect: My dear Will, I am quite satisfied with your decision respecting Bob. By all means, send him to the school you are thinking of. He will get on better there. His education requires more pushing than it gets at present. Thanks for all you have done for him. God bless you. Your affectionate cousin, Ataska. I do not pretend to give the exact words of this letter, for though they were afterwards published, I have not a copy by me. But the gist of the experiment does not lie in the exactitude of the words. When I saw the slate, I looked at Mr. Lee in astonishment. Who is it for? I asked. It is all right, he replied, it is for me. It is from my cousin, who left his boy in my charge. My real name is William Tasker. Now, I had never heard it hinted before that Edgar Lee was only a nom de plume, and the announcement came on me as a genuine surprise. So satisfied was Mr. William Tasker Edgar Lee with his experimental seance, that he had the slate photographed and reproduced in the St. Stephen's Review, with an account of the whole proceedings, which was sufficient to make anyone stop for a moment in the midst of the world's harassing duties and think,